Well, friends, an appeals court just affirmed Steve Bannon's criminal conviction, and Bannon is now one giant step closer to having to serve his prison term. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. Well, friends, that justice was a long time coming. One of Donald Trump's criminally convicted close associates, Steve Bannon, just had his conviction affirmed by a D.C. appeals court, and now Steve Bannon finds himself on the short list for prison. Let's start with the new reporting, and then we'll take a quick look at some of the newly released appeals court decision affirming Bannon's conviction. Headline: Steve Bannon's bid to undo January 6th contempt conviction fails. And that article begins, former Trump advisor Stephen Bannon was rightfully convicted of contempt of Congress for refusing to testify in front of the committee that investigated the January 6, 2021 Capitol attack, an appellate court ruled Friday. The court did not immediately order Bannon to begin serving his 4-month prison sentence. Instead, he has 7 days to ask for reconsideration in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. The unanimous decision was written by Brad Garcia, the newest member of the court. Bannon, quote, deliberately refused to comply with the Select Committee's subpoena in that he knew what the subpoena required and intentionally did not respond, and gave no persuasive argument for doing so, Judge Garcia wrote. Quote, Bannon failed to comply with the subpoena, and his failure to comply was willful. Bannon, now a right-wing podcaster who continued to spread false claims about the 2020 election, was sentenced in 2022 to prison for ignoring the congressional subpoena, but remains out on bond while challenging that conviction. He maintains that he was following legal advice in refusing to cooperate with the committee. That argument, quote, runs headlong into settled law, Judge Garcia wrote, which says that when it comes to answering a subpoena, quote, this exact advice of counsel defense is no defense at all. Peter Navarro, a senior Trump aide who said in a memoir that he and Bannon had a plan for January 6th that would keep President Biden from taking office, reported to prison in March for his contempt conviction and identical sentence. Bannon argued that his lawyer advised him not to answer the subpoena unless and until former President Donald Trump waived any executive privilege over their communications. But the records show that both Trump attorney Justin Clark and House Committee Chairman Benny G. Thompson told Bannon through his attorney that he was not protected from testifying by any presidential immunity. Okay, friends, now before we turn to just the one short passage that I want to read from today's appeals court opinion, let's take on a couple of other questions. First of all, this was a unanimous decision by a 3-judge panel. Who were those judges? Well, one was a Trump appointee, one was an Obama appointee, and one was a Biden appointee. Now, you heard that Bannon now has 7 days to try to convince the full appeals court, what we call en banc review, full court review, the full appeals court to revisit the unanimous 3-judge opinion that was just published. I'm going to go out on a limb and say there's no way Steve Bannon is going to persuade a majority of the appeals court judges that the unanimous 3-judge opinion was wrong. So after the 7 days expires, what happens? Well, Steve Bannon undoubtedly will petition to the Supreme Court, trying to get them to review the denial of his appeal, and I'm sure asking that he please be allowed to stay out pending the Supreme Court's decision on whether to accept his case for review, because of course he wants to keep broadcasting in his podcast things that are dangerous to our democracy, the way he has been all along. I hate to try to predict what the Supreme Court will do, but when I read the appeals court opinion that was just handed down today, the judges made clear that Steve Bannon had no viable arguments. Why? Because there was binding precedent, case law, affirmed several times over, that shot down Steve Bannon's arguments. So, when Steve Bannon tries to get the Supreme Court to take this case for review, I would like to think they will be persuaded that there's all this settled precedent that easily defeats Bannon's claim. So, of course, the Supreme Court won't grant review and do Steve Bannon, a close associate of Donald Trump, a favor, though. Then again, the Supreme Court did go against its own settled precedent of 50 years when the extreme right-wing bloc of the Supreme Court decided to revoke women's constitutional privacy rights. And that's why we're going to get out in November to the polls in numbers too big to rig and too real to steal. But I digress. I often do. So I'm not going to place a bet on whether the Supreme Court will do Steve Bannon a solid, but I don't think they will. This is not the kind of issue I believe they will feel compelled to take up. So that means within a couple of weeks, Steve Bannon could be given his reporting date to the Federal Bureau of Prisons to begin serving his 4-month sentence. He'll be in good company. His fellow criminal associate, Peter Navarro, is serving 4 months presently, maybe keeping a bunk warm for Steve Bannon. But let me take on one other issue before we turn to a very brief passage of today's opinion, and that is these convictions that were just affirmed only involve Steve Bannon criminally violating a congressional subpoena. He was served 2 subpoenas because the J6 committee knew he had potentially incriminating evidence against Donald Trump to provide, and they subpoenaed him to testify. That was one subpoena. And they subpoenaed him for documents. That was the second subpoena. And Bannon said, take a flying leap. I'm not complying with these subpoenas. He went to trial. The jury convicted him in a hot minute, and he was sentenced to 4 months in prison. Unfortunately, a Trump-appointed judge, Nichols, decided to leave him out and about pending appeal for a couple of years now, again, so he could continue to work to undermine American democracy on his podcast and elsewhere. Good job, Judge Nichols. Peter Navarro, who committed the exact same 2 crimes, who similarly went to trial and went down in flames. The jury convicted him in a D.C. minute. He was sentenced to 4 months, and a fair, impartial, independent judge, Amit Mehta, said, no, you'll be reporting to the Bureau of Prisons and serving your 4 months. You can file an appeal. That's your right, but you're going to prison, and that's where Peter Navarro is right now. Not Steve Bannon. What a difference a judge makes. Trump-appointed Judge Nichols and Judge Amit Mehta. Same crime, same conviction, same sentence, dramatically different handling of those 2 cases. Equal application of our laws? Hardly. So here's the other thing I want to take up before we turn briefly to the opinion. Steve Bannon has only been held accountable for 2 crimes, violating 2 congressional subpoenas. What he has not been held accountable for is running the Willard War Room on and around January 6th to try to criminally keep Donald Trump installed in the presidency and to try to criminally deny Joe Biden his rightful election win, trying to criminally override the expressed will of the American voters. For all of those crimes, Steve Bannon has not yet been prosecuted. And there's something in today's appeals court opinion that maybe provides a little bit of foreshadowing of problems to come for Steve Bannon. Let's have a quick look at the opinion. This from the unanimous three-judge panel. Quote, public accounts indicated that Bannon had predicted on a January 5, 2021 podcast that all hell was going to break loose the next day being January 6, the day of the Capitol attack. Bannon had been employed as an advisor to then-President Donald Trump for approximately 7 months before leaving the White House in 2017. In addition to the podcast prediction, Bannon had reportedly participated in discussions in late 2020 and early 2021 about efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. So, the court opinion continues, Congress had every right and every reason to subpoena Steve Bannon to try to extract from him the incriminating information and evidence he had about Donald Trump and others. There's a bit of an ironic twist here, friends, because had he complied with the subpoena and just shown up at the congressional hearing and pled the Fifth, invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, he could have been on his way because he undoubtedly has a Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination for his own criminal conduct. But you can't just blow off a subpoena. You can't just thumb your nose at a subpoena. You have to appear and invoke any privileges you might have that, might actually be recognized by the law. So Bannon just kind of cut off his nose to spite his face. Didn't want to show up and plead the Fifth, perhaps for obvious reasons, so instead committed the crime of contempt of Congress ×2, was convicted, was sentenced. His conviction has now been affirmed, and he'll be heading to prison soon. But the reason I read that passage to you, friends, was because I hope these criminal charges against Steve Bannon that were just affirmed, I hope they're just for openers. I hope Jack Smith and/or the Department of Justice intends to indict Steve Bannon for his crimes on and around January 6th, not just for blowing off congressional subpoenas, for the fact that he was running the Willard War Room, trying to override the expressed will of the American voters. Yeah, he needs to be held accountable for those crimes as well. And let's hope that passage that I read is a sign of things to come. But there's one other problem Steve Bannon has, friends. Let's not forget, he's indicted in a big old felony scheme up in New York, for putting together that bogus We Build the Wall Foundation and then stealing from Trump's supporters. He's pending a felony trial in New York. He was actually supposed to go to trial this month, later this month in May, but interestingly, the presiding judge is a judge named Juan Merchan. He's wrapped up at the moment, presiding over Donald Trump's criminal trial in New York. So ultimately, Steve Bannon's trial date got pushed to, I believe, September. So it's a bit of a quandary. Will Steve Bannon's September trial be able to start for his felony fraud case for bilking Trump supporters out of their money, with this fictitious We Build the Wall Foundation? Will it be able to start in September if he's serving a federal prison term of 4 months for 2 counts of contempt of Congress? Challenges. Suffice it to say, friends, at some point he will serve the 4 months. At some point he will go to trial in New York in his other felony case. He is very likely to be convicted and sentenced to prison in connection with those crimes. Maybe someday Steve Bannon will have a change of heart and say, the path I've chose, hooking my wagon to Donald Trump and doing his dirty bidding all along, hasn't turned out so good for me. Heading to prison ×2, perhaps, federally and state. Maybe I should cooperate with prosecutors. Maybe I should unload all of the incriminating evidence I have against Donald Trump and so many others. Maybe I should turn a corner. Maybe I should do the right thing. Steve Bannon will probably think about it and then say to himself, nah. Because to him, I'm not sure justice matters. But to us, justice matters. Friends, as always, please stay safe, please stay tuned, and I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.